Glasgow is a city with a strong sense of character, style and fashion, and with shops such as the City Retro Fashion and Vintage Guru, it has become a popular spot for vintage and retro shops. Also, with the emergence of the Granny Would Be Proud Vintage Fair in the West End, it has developed a strong repertoire of vintage traders. With items ranging from the 2000s right back to the Victorian period, these shops attract all sorts of customers from all different age groups.
The shop premises as a shop has been a clothes shop dealing in second hand and that sort of thing for over 20 years. 7 years ago our friend took it over as a vintage shop. We took over the shop on the 4th of June. Officially we reopened and we've been going since the 4th of June 2015. It was the best decision we ever made.
Because we are in the West End, we get quite a lot of students. But we get really everyone from children coming in just to spend their pocket money to like older people like in their 80s or 90s who are coming in and buying our really good quality like Harris tweeds, and it's like what it was like for them at the time was really good quality clothing.
So Granny Would Be Proud was started by my wife as a marketing venture, and it was just something that she was doing as a vintage market. You know, it wasn't really done before. Craft markets and things were, but vintage wasn't really done. So she put on a big event, invited traders of vintage and craft to come along and trade at the market, and it got a really good reception. She got invited into a new venue where she could run the market as her own thing in the Hillhead Book Club. It's been run there for the last 5 years. Everything is all sourced from different suppliers. We've got mainland European suppliers, we've got local people who are specialists who bring us in some very good stuff. We've got a variety of supply.
We mainly buy off the public. Usually it's vintage and designer that we buy. Really it's anything from the 1970s backwards because the rest of it is very readily available. So they come in and we give them an appraisal and then we buy it off of them completely and sell it on. Also the owner, she was a collector and she was also a supplier for 15 years before she opened the business. So she has a massive backstock of lots of different kinds of items from like designer in like the 80s and 90s to right back to the 1920s and Victorian. Even before we opened, this is where I used to come for vintage. It's historically had quite a lot of really nice vintage shops, a lot of little boutiques. And since we've been here, there's been lots of vintage shops opening and closing again. We've been here for so long and so have all the other stores.
The West End initially perhaps was a hub, but actually looking around, there has been vintage throughout Glasgow City for years with Flip, the Vintage Arcade. Those were all places that were throughout Glasgow. They weren't just focused in the West End. Perhaps the West End has a small focus because of the number of students there. Now with the growth of the other universities, vintage is growing throughout the city in lots of places.
It really peaked, I think, when we first opened in 2009, 2008. A lot of people started realising that what vintage was, that you could keep wearing it. It became a very popular thing for mainly students. They all started to get into it, whereas it was more of a specialised thing before that.
I think it's different from today's market and you feel a little bit more unique when you wear it. I like how it reflects the style of a different era.
There's lots of different things you can find in vintage clothes that you just wouldn't ever find from a designer's mind today.
My mum held on to a lot of her clothes from the 70s and 80s, and also my gran held on to a lot of hers.
Maybe it's been thought of once and maybe it will come around again as part of a fad or part of a trend, but it's not, vintage I don't feel is always about that. It's, you know, it's not necessarily about following that trend, it's just about finding what's nice that's previously happened and actually maintaining it and using it.
I feel that vintage clothing it's just so unique, and it just reflects how much fashion has changed through the years, and how like it's inspired, and it's just basically inspired like today's fashion world.
So if you look at any kind of high street store like Topshop or New Look or whatever, they're using all the 1970s prints. They're using all of the 80s cuts, like puffer jackets, they're 80s. People come in here because they like all the 70s really colourful things, like even the tracksuit jackets like of the 1990s and 2000 really. Like it was big colourful prints, 1980s as well, really, really colourful neon colours.
I think fashion is not really the best way to describe vintage. I think more style is the best way to kind of talk about it in that sense.
Just like the history of a single item, and it's like different in style and texture from like today. I feel that vintage clothing it's just so unique. And it just reflects how much fashion has changed through the years.
A lot of people like the history of the things, mainly I think from the 50s backwards, but as time goes on, obviously that will collect much more as well.
There is a kind of like-mindedness to people who shop vintage. They're very open, they're very easy. People who shop in this sort of style are very easy to get on with and don't hold any prejudice or any kind of labels towards anybody or anything.
People are coming in mainly because they are looking for something completely different.
I do think there is more to vintage clothing than just fashion items. Vintage is an idea, it's a style, it's something a lot of people are into, but everybody's different.
With Vintage Guru's ever-growing popularity in the West End and shops like Mr Ben's and the City Retro Fashion challenging the mainstream high street vendors, Glasgow is becoming a hub for vintage and retro clothing in the UK. With events like the Granny Would Be Proud Fair getting bigger and better every year, it seems that vintage clothing has a strong future in this great city.